first mention of the Nephilim in the Bible. It's in Genesis 6, and it says the Nephilim were in the earth in those days when they procreated with the daughters of men. Now, I imagine when the Bible was written, people were supposed to know who the Nephilim were. Which brings up an interesting point, because how were people supposed to know this? Obviously there were other books around at the time that spoke of the Nephilim, and they were since lost. It's not really specific in the Bible exactly who the hell the Nephilim were, but they were basically beings who were not human, who came from another planet or another dimension, and that's really the idea behind them. The Nephilim were also mentioned in other books not included in the Bible, like the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is a discarded book of the Bible. He was a guy who lived before Noah, and he wrote a book or a series of books about his adventures before the flood. And it has a very interesting history. Enoch wrote about a race of beings called the Watchers, who existed in the land of Sumer. And Sumer is now modern-day Iraq. Around 9000 BC, these Watchers existed and interacted with men. And they were considered to be a race of blonde-haired giants, which is kind of cool, I guess. These were very interesting times because these Watchers, or angels as they may have also been called, were considered rebellious, and they were looking at the women on earth and thinking they were attractive, and they had sex with these women, and they produced a race of beings known as the Nephilim. There was kind of like a big genetic experiment going on, or so it's indicated in the Book of Enoch, because these Nephilim were often giants or creatures that were just bizarre and strange looking. And there was a real push in those times for people to prove their bloodline, to prove that they weren't part of the Watchers, or that their lineage did not go back to the Watchers. And they thought actually Noah may have been a Nephilim at one point because he was born with blonde hair or he was very white. But he had to prove that his bloodline was not of the caste of the Watchers. And that's why God spared him and his family. So we have to ask ourselves, why is the Book of Enoch not considered a part of the Bible? In Jesus' times, it was considered part of the religious text of the day. Jesus even quoted from the Book of Enoch, and I think pretty much everyone in ancient times considered the Book of Enoch to be a religious and holy document. So many copies of the Book of Enoch were sent to Ethiopia, and they were rediscovered, I think, in the 1770s. Modern man took it and translated it, and there's been many versions of it that exist. And they compared the modern translation they have to fragments they found in 300 BC and found it to be pretty much identical. So whichever way you look at it, if you believe it's the Word of God or not, that's beside the point. It's an interesting historical document, and it tells some pretty spooky stuff. A lot of stuff I think has been cut out of the Bible, which maybe should have been kept in. I think Moses probably considered it, the Book of Enoch, the Word of God, because as I said, he even mentioned the Nephilim himself in Genesis. So it was considered common knowledge that the Nephilim existed, at least when the Bible was written, or the book of Genesis was written. So he's obviously referring to something very specific. And the interesting thing was, the Nephilim, as it says in Genesis, were not wiped out. They existed after the Great Flood as well. So I mean, there was a lot of strange things going on that are kind of mysterious to us. And that's why I think the whole thing is very interesting, and it's worth investigating and studying. Now, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the Emperor Constantine decided to put an end to all the warring factions of the Christians, because all the different Christians around the place were running off in different tangents and different ideas, kind of like a lot of them do today. There were some Christians who believed there was reincarnation. There were some Christians who believed that Jesus was a man. Some Christians believed Jesus was God. And he decided to unite all of the faiths and all of the books of the Bible into one New Testament. At that time, the Council of Nicaea took a lot of the books and rejected a lot of the books, things like the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, and other, I guess, historical works, and they were kind of discarded and thrown away. And many of these books were lost for a long time until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The Dead Sea Scrolls were basically a collection of books that were put aside by the Essenes, and it's interesting to note that a lot of the Gospels that were banned were Gospels that spoke about angels and Nephilim and Watchers and similar sort of beings.
So there's almost been a bit of a cover-up in history over the nature of who these beings were. Like the Gospel of Judas is a very interesting book. It speaks that Judas was on the inside track of knowledge, and he and Jesus had a special understanding, and they spoke heavily about angels or watchers or the hierarchy of angels in heaven and kind of how they interacted with man on earth. So there's more to this Nephilim story than, I guess, the first few words in Genesis. There really is an interesting history about it, and when you look into the historical fragments we have, I think there's some wisdom to be gained.
Unfortunately, a terrible thing happened when the Library of Alexandria burnt down in 300 AD, or approximately around that time. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls which contained the knowledge of the ancients were contained in this Library of Alexandria, and it was a terrible, terrible thing because all this incredible knowledge was lost. And of course it would include things like ancient books talking about the Nephilim and stuff like that. So we only have fragments. We're left with small pieces to try and put it all together. So I've taken some of those fragments and expanded on the idea.